Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big Al Devlin video here at the House of Devlin. Thank you very much for tuning in. This video is going to be a discussion. I still want to get into talking about the runes on a cosmological scale, but this is a continuation of the sort of prep work that we need to do before we get into that discussion, because discussing the runes on a cosmological scale does require I wouldn't say a basic understanding. It's quite complicated, it's quite profound and convoluted, but you do need a certain level of understanding of the sort of framework of the universe, the framework of life, and the framework of how pagans view not only this world but the spiritual worlds and how they all interact, how pagans view, for example, the flow of fate, time and life together all interacted. You need this basic understanding, or this, as I say, it's not basic, patronising there because it's very complicated, but you need this very strong understanding of the universe and paganism as a whole, the concept of paganism as a whole within the cosmological side of things, to be as strong as possible before you move into discussing the runes, as I say, on a cosmological scale, because without the foundations all the knowledge on top falls down. So we need to build up our foundations first, so then we can start building our houses on top and stuff and start achieving a high level of knowledge. Okay, and so I do have the first 8 of runes carved now, so I've achieved and that's really what this video is about. It is about fate. And what fate does, fate achieves and attenuates possibilities or probabilities and turns them into actions or events, ultimately. Fate is the driving force, an intelligent driving force, you could even argue, behind the universe almost, that is constantly pushing forward everything within, not only in the material realm but the spiritual realm also. It's driving it forwards towards this end point, which is Ragnarok. And this is the video why Ragnarok is inevitable, why the universe one day will end and then begin anew once more. And this is my understanding of it. Now, I've been focusing on the runes, Seder, things like this, paganism as a whole for a reasonable amount of time, but still not a huge amount of time, not decades and decades and decades. And so, you know, this is my understanding at this point of time, and although my understanding gives an insight into the ways and the workings of the universe, don't take my word 100%. Formulate your own thoughts. Take what I say and think, is he right about what he says there? And argue with yourself, have a discussion in your head, so to speak, and question everything I say. And if you come up with a new viewpoint, or a more complex, a more developed viewpoint based upon the knowledge now that I share with you, then fantastic, share it with me back. You know, do a video, send me the link, or put it in the comments, and we will develop our knowledge of paganism together. This is what paganism is about. You know, it's about growing within yourself, and as you grow, sharing the knowledge that you have developed during your lifetime, and then hopefully then by the time it comes to your end within the material universe, you pass your knowledge on to the next generation, and they have your knowledge set that you've taken 60, 70, 80 years if you're lucky, you know, 80 years of studying paganism, concentrating on it. If you've shared all that knowledge with the younger generation, they've got 80 years advantage on top of what you did when you first started, right? And then they can work with that, develop it and develop it and develop it, and so paganism becomes a deeper faith, a deeper religion as time progresses. And this is the ultimate of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve as pagans. It's about achieving greatness for yourself, for self, but also helping to achieve greatness for other also. And you must share your greatness. You must share your progress and journey through life, and aid others to achieve their greatness. And all greatness is just achieving your potential. and perhaps even going beyond it if you can, you know, to achieve the most that you can within the short period of space and time that we have here in the material realm within Midgard. And so this is why I do these videos. And so you may hate them, you may, you know, become a troll one day on these videos, go, oh, look at him talking. I don't care. These videos are for the people who care, the people who want to learn, and the people who care about the religion and the faith as a whole of paganism, or who are just simply interested. You may not be a pagan, but I hope that interest sometimes it will lay a seed, and from, you know, even the mightiest of oaks come from acorns, yes? So if I plant the acorns, hopefully they sprout into great and mighty oaks, and one day I may convince you to look at paganism not just with an historical interest, but perhaps a little bit more, perhaps with an element of faith there, like I have. And anyway, enough of the sort of propaganda, so to speak. I'm not trying to convert you as such, although I am. But no, I'm not here to try and really convert you. I'm here to educate. And I'm here to strengthen the knowledge of our fellow pagans. And so this video, as I say, is all about why do we know for 100% certain that the universe will end. And I've touched upon this a little bit before on other videos, as I say, when discussing the framework of the universe, discussing fate and destiny. What's the difference between destiny and fate, if there is any, you know? Which really is arguably, you know, well, destiny is just made of fate, so there is no difference, but there is a difference. Watch the videos, you'll understand if you haven't already watched it. And if you have watched it and forgotten, rewatch them, just refresh your memory and come back, because you will need that kind of knowledge to progress further with this video. Okay, so we've discussed, as I say, the major sort of framework of the universe with the macro scale and the micro scale sort of fates and destinies that exist within it, that drive the universe forward to achieve events or actions, to essentially fulfill probabilities and convert them into action, as I say, into an event. Okay, in doing this, the universe progresses. Without the attenuation of probabilities, nothing would happen. Simply by talking to you watching this video, these are actions, these are events. This is fate being fulfilled. Okay, these are probabilities or possibilities being fulfilled, and so we are doing it right now as we speak, because why? We are a form of life, or a life form, as I say. But a life form is simply a form of life, and all life, be it inanimate or sentient like ourselves, tries to achieve as many probabilities and possibilities as it can within its lifespan, if it has a limited lifespan. Okay, that goes right from ourselves to inanimate objects, which obviously don't really achieve much, but you know, they're there, and their creation was an event. You know, like the table, for example, that my PC is standing on, is, you know, was created at one point. That was an event. While the parts were created, that was one event, and then I assembled them because it was a flat pack. That was a secondary event, and then every time I turn this PC on, there's another event linked to this table. So this table is constantly being integrated into fate, into events. So even though it's inanimate, it's still contributing to the fulfillment of action. But it's also for contributing to the fulfillment of not just creation, but also destruction, because over time this will wear and tear. If I was to leave it, it would eventually rot, and it would rust, and it would turn to dust, as will all things within the universe. And so this is why we are going to sort of be focusing on, ultimately, how fate ultimately, yes, leads to creation, leads to events, but in a sort of paradoxical kind of manner also leads to destruction becoming so great that it ends itself, it ends the realities that it's created, so that a new one may be birthed and created. Now, I'm trying to think of I know we've started there, but a really strong starting point. How can we look at this? I think one way is to think of the Rune of Fehu. Okay? Fehu is the point at which is at, on a cosmological scale. And as I say, we'll go into this in the cosmological runes at a later date. But on a cosmological scale, briefly put, Fehu is simply the desire or the seeking out process to fulfill probabilities and possibilities. At the beginning of the universe, at the very beginning, before time really truly exists, because remember, as fate flows, time flows. So fate isn't quite moving at this point. Fate is static, slightly static at this point. There's a stasis, and this is discussed within the runes, as we'll see. There is a stasis, and we represent that actually in the form of the rune Isa. Okay, this is a stasis. There's sort of a locking point between creation and destruction. And at this locking point, basically there is oneness within the universe. All probabilities from the previous reality that could be fulfilled have been fulfilled, and as probabilities are filled, okay, the universe comes to understand itself to a greater depth. It's the same process in which how we learn, essentially. When we complete an event or have an experience, a lifetime experience, and if we assimilate the information that comes from that, we learn from that, and we become more of ourselves. Ultimately, we learn who we are. There's that little bit more. We go that little baby step forwards towards learning our true self and becoming one with ourselves. Yes. We learn about the self, and then eventually when we get beyond that, we also then begin to learn about the others, as I say, those around us, and we learn that they are the same thing. But I'm going a little bit beyond where we need to talk about at the moment. But what I'm trying to say is the universe is exactly the same as a human being in that sense. We are constantly learning, constantly assimilating information, and constantly using that information and that learning to progress ourselves into a higher state of learning, a higher state of existence and being, so that we can then do more complicated acts and eventually develop ourselves. It could be something as simple as having a new television and learning how to program it, how to turn it on, and having a smart telly for the very first time, connecting it to the internet. You may not know how to do it, but once you've done it once, the second time you come to do it, you already know what you're doing. You don't need to read the manual. And it's like that, you've assimilated the information, and so you're a high state of learning. So things that once were complicated now seem childish or simple. And it's the same principle. And so the universe, as I say, when you consider Fehu is the point at which the universe has achieved oneness. In its previous reality, its previous existence, if there was a previous existence, we may be in the first reality, we don't know this. But in its previous existence, or at the very beginning of its existence, it has oneness. All the probabilities and all the possibilities from the previous reality have been achieved. The universe has learnt as much about itself as possible, combined self and other, the separation of fate, as we'll go into. Fate separates oneness into possibilities and probabilities, which we call selves and others. And when they all combine, you get one. And it's at the state of oneness that fehu really represents, where all the selves and others, all the probabilities, all the different possibilities have been learned, incorporated, and have achieved oneness. But that fate is still there. Fate still exists, and fate it constantly wants to drive things forwards. It's a driving power, and an unimaginable powerful force that causes the separation of this oneness, the fragmentation of all these possibilities, all this potential, Okay, because this just represents potential, the potential for another universe to begin. Fate causes this potential to separate into an infinite amount of possibilities and probabilities, which then the universe, because fate's driving it forwards, driving then now time, it's created time and it's driving the progression of time forwards, it causes the universe to then try to fulfill as many of these probabilities as it possibly can. In fact, the universe attempts to fulfill every single possibility and probability, i.e. fate or event or an action as possible. And this will be in the material realm, on the atomic level, whether an atom combines with another atom, say like in a star, for example, hydrogen combining together because of the influence of heat to form a helium atom. Well, that's an event. Okay, so it works at an atomic level and a molecular level. It works at our level. As a human being, it works on so we go from the heavens, essentially, what we would call celestial bodies. It works at our level. I've just talked about atoms, haven't I? So it works at the the atomic level. It works at our level when we go out there and achieve events like I've just discussed by creating tables and things like this and just living our lives. But it also works on the celestial scale, also when stars are born, as I say, and that also, that's why I got confused, links in then into the atomic level, because of course there are atoms within even the very largest of things within the universe, and so there's lots of mini actions occurring with a very few big actions and a lot of medium actions in between, which should be us. Okay, and so the universe is trying to achieve as many possibilities, as many probabilities as possible, and as it does so, there is creation. Whenever anything happens, whenever something occurs, whether there is a creation of a physical object or not, whenever just simply an action occurs, such as that stone dropping out of my hand, and that's gravity. But it's still an event. It has fallen, and that simple process of falling is still an action. It's still a fulfillment of a possibility or probability. And when that possibility or probability or that action or event is fulfilled, the universe takes that fulfillment essentially and integrates it into itself, and so it gains oneness as it goes along. So at the beginning we have oneness, then we have fragmentation. So there's no oneness at all anymore. There's just the ultimate, literally infinite possibility and potential, an infinite amount of possibilities and potentialities here, and that's what fehu represents, the infinite potential of the universe right at the very beginning, and the seeking out process, the desire to fulfill all those possibilities as much as possible. And then as the universe goes along in time, you start achieving many of those probabilities and possibilities, but you can't achieve all of them. It's impossible. Why? Because fate is not infinite. Fate, there's only so much of it, and so it's infinite in the sense that it's recycled, so it can last for an infinite period of time. It will never run out. Just like energy is a constant in the universe, it can never be created, nor can it be destroyed. It can just simply be converted from one form into another. We ourselves as physical beings are just energy locked in physical matter. But when we die, that physical matter gets dispersed as whatever energy, but it will eventually become some form of chemical energy, and then probably some thermal energy. As I speak now, I'm very hot in this room at the moment, and probably you can see the sweat on me. I'm emitting thermal energy, heat energy all the time, and so I'm losing a part of myself constantly, and I have to maintain that with food and oxygen, breathing, the simple processes of life. However, as I say, as we go along, we are achieving these possibilities, we are achieving these probabilities, and incorporate that. And as that happens, immediately the universe just gains a little bit more of its oneness that it originally had at the beginning, which is what the universe is ultimately wanting to do. Fate is the force that separates oneness, but it's also the driving force that creates oneness. It's paradoxical. Why does it destroy oneness when all it wants after that is for oneness to be achieved? It's strange, but fate is like that. And as I say, because even though it can last an infinite period of time, because it is recycled, as we discussed in the previous video with Yggdrasil, with the fate coming from like the well of Erd and the roots of Yggdrasil ultimately to going through the trunk and into the leaves of the tree, but it then forms dewdrops, which then falls back down, is reabsorbed by the roots, goes into the well of Erd and then back up. So it's a complete cycle of fate. So it's a complete recycling of fate, and that fate is then spread throughout the realms, because Yggdrasil is just essentially a celestial or a sort of spiritual connection between all the realms, and it allows fate to spread throughout all the realms, be it they spiritual or material, as we of course exist within. But you know, the reason we're not discussing the spiritual realms and how fate interacts within the spiritual realms and stuff like this within this video is because, well, you know, okay, I have been to the spiritual realms, but it's, you know, I don't understand them. I have not been there. It's taken me 30 years to get of living and events, life events, and then a you know, decision to take up paganism and become pagan, you know, for a few years of that, to get to the stage of understanding this material realm that we exist within. It will take an infinitely longer period of time for me to understand the spiritual realm once I die, but of course then we begin a new learning process once we die, I suppose, based perhaps upon the foundational knowledge that we achieve within the material universe. But this video, as I say, is all about why we have Ragnarok. Now, this is the organic process of learning within paganism. I'm trying to teach you this. Why do we have a Ragnarok? Why do we have the end of the universe? But as I'm going along, I'm branching off into different areas, and this is not a bad thing. Waffling, as it's sometimes known, it's just me sort of teaching myself. As I talk, I see new things, and I'm like, oh yes, yeah, I might as well talk about that. And so you learn lots of little bits of knowledge, as well as the bit of knowledge that we're constantly trying to progress and push to. But don't worry, we will get to the point, so please hang on with me, guys. We will get to the point as to why the universe ended. Well, will end. Why existence, both spiritual and material, will end. And so, as I say, we have possibilities and probabilities achieved, attenuated, and completed. As they are, they then become, or an element of them, becomes integrated within the, as I say, the oneness of the universe. It gains a bit of a greater understanding of itself, and because obviously the universe is much larger than ourselves, for example, you've got to consider that there are billions upon billions upon billions upon billions, if not even more, events occurring every second within the universe. And so the universe is really learning a lot about itself every second that it progresses within time, and it is developing a vast amount of oneness as a result of that learning. But there is a vast amount of oneness at the very beginning, obviously. As you can imagine, the scale of it is immense. It's beyond our comprehension almost, and obviously you've not just got the material universe, i.e. Midgard, contributing towards this, but you also have all the, as I say, all the actions and events that occur within the spiritual realms also contributing towards it. And so you can imagine how big this oneness at the beginning, this potential, okay, was at the very beginning. And that potential, as I say, it's a huge amount, but it can still not achieve. There's a limit to the potential, and as a result it cannot achieve an infinite amount of probabilities and possibilities. And so, as I say, time will go, and fate will go forwards over time, and unfortunately it will just reach a point where we know, for example, prediction of how the universe, this material realm that we exist within, will one day die. And it really corroborates very well with Ragnarok, the idea of Ragnarok, where certainly within the Nordic idea of Ragnarok, and I assume the rest of paganism, that there will simply be just a long winter, following, the destruction of everything, essentially. And that's essentially what we already know within science, that basically because energy can neither be created nor destroyed, as the universe continues to expand and fulfill itself, because fate driving it forwards. The expansion of the universe, you could just see simply as a progression of the pushing force of fate. That's why the universe is expanding. You could see it like along those lines if you wish. And the universe is constantly expanding or creating itself more to the point, because outside the universe, what is there? There's nothingness. There's essentially, it's Gununganap within the cosmology of paganism. It's Gununganap. And so it can't expand into nothingness. You can't expand into nothingness because there's nothing to expand into. And so the universe on its outermost edges, which we cannot see with even the best of our telescopes, but on the edge, I've always wondered as a scientist, what is it expanding into? And it's taken paganism actually to answer this question. So this is where religion and science don't normally mix, but paganism does, because it allows you to take knowledge that you've learned within your life and integrate it with your faith. Okay? It's one of the few religions that allows you to do this. In fact, it encourages it, because the more we understand about the realm that we live in, the more we understand about our religion. As you can see, the way I'm talking about it. And as a scientist, I always wondered, how is the universe constantly expanding? What is it expanding into? Obviously, it's expanding into whatever was there before the universe really existed, but when it was just a tiny little speck, really, before it expanded in the Big Bang. And I was thinking, what is it expanding into? But it's not expanding into anything. It's creating itself. And as it creates itself, it's causing creation, and so nothingness can no longer exist where there is creation. And so Gununganap is infinite, but is being pushed back ultimately, and so there's potentially an infinite size to the universe. And this is where our problem exists, because of infinity. Infinity can never be achieved. This is just a mathematical sort of, fact. Okay? And I don't really know how to explain it to you, but just infinity, this can never be achieved. You could spend 100,000 lifetimes counting 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll never get to infinity. The only way that you'll do it is if you have an infinite time period, and then eventually you'll get to infinity, at infinity. But you can never reach infinity, because it's literally a number that kind of doesn't exist. It's infinitely large. It's incomprehensibly big, essentially. It's beyond understanding to some degree. Okay, yes, it can be defined to some degree mathematically, but it is still cannot be defined. It cannot be used to that degree. Okay, and so infinity is a problem. Okay, because and this is where it becomes a problem. Even though we essentially have an infinite amount of fate, we still have a finite amount of fate. We only have so much fate. The only reason it's infinite is because it's being recycled. And just like energy is finite but infinite in the sense that it can never be created nor destroyed. Essentially, it's also recycled between physical and thermal, kinetic, all the different types of energies out there. It is itself recycled. But within, as I say, our knowledge, our actual real scientific knowledge that we have, that has been proven, that no one could argue with. People can always argue with religion to say, well, that's religion, but they can't argue with science, even though science is in itself a religion. You have to have faith in the figures, so to speak, for it to actually mean anything, really. You have to just, how do you know that your science is correct? You could argue. And the reason you know it's right is because you have a faith that it's right, that the maths is right, that mathematics is not an illusion of the mind, so to speak. Now, I'm a scientist, so I'm not poo-pooing science. As I say, I encourage all pagans to grasp, improve their knowledge of science and of mathematics, because mathematics is the language of the universe, the material realm that we live within. It may even be the language of the spiritual realms. We don't know this because, as I say, we don't have a vast experience of the spiritual realms and living within it. But we do know, as I say, it exists within the material realms, and it gives us constants. It gives us relativity. It gives us everything that we need to have to experience life events. Without mathematics, we could not fulfill fates. We could not fulfill possibilities and probabilities. It's as simple as that, because there would be no law. And Midgard is of the Innengard. It's ordered. Okay, and that's why mathematics rules essentially our realm, because there is law and order within Midgard. And yes, there is chaos also, because of course energy can be chaotically dispersed, as we'll go into as I'm making my words towards now. But ultimately, certainly at the beginning, there is order, and that's the important thing. And so as we progress towards this point of infinity, even though we have an infinite amount of fate and we have an infinite amount of energy, as the universe gets bigger and bigger, that energy and that fate becomes greatly dispersed. It becomes more and more dispersed, until the point where really it's not able to do anything else. On the energy level, okay, this is science now, regards energy, essentially just what will happen is eventually the universe will just reach a point where all the energy is evenly distributed, and essentially you'll have probably absolute zero, I think it is, which is a temperature where basically nothing happens, okay, throughout the whole universe. There's not, even though there's the same amount of energy as there at this point in the universe as there is within the universe at the moment, there is simply, the universe is that big, the energy is so spread out that it can't achieve anything. There's not enough energy focused in a certain point to actually achieve any probability or possibility. And the same thing happens with fate. Fate just becomes infinitely dispersed, or vastly dispersed, because obviously we never reach that point of infinity, but it becomes so vastly dispersed that it no longer has the power to drive anything of significance, at the very least, and they will then reach a point where bang, it stops. It stops driving the universe forward, because it's achieved every single possibility and probability that is available to it, that it could have achieved within the time period that that universe has existed. Okay. At that point, that's probably then when we have Isa, a stasis point, where at this point all the probabilities that have been achieved by the universe, which is vast, it will be the amount of, beyond the amount of fate that you have. Fate, as I say, because it's been recycled, is a major power horse, a major driving force that drives the universe forwards and allows it to achieve more possibilities and probabilities than it could do for the amount of fate that flows through it. Because it's recycled, it achieves a huge amount of oneness, because, as I say, as you achieve all these probabilities get fed back into the universe in one way through oneness. These probabilities combine, self and other combine, to form oneness. And this is where I'm struggling to really communicate with you guys, because explaining what oneness is, until you've kind of seen it by focusing on the runes or using Seda or Gauda or whatever kind of magic or focusing that you believe in, or just simply just focusing on the topic as a whole without the runes involved and stuff, and until you learn it, you don't know it. You can't understand it. It's like, because we've never experienced infinity, no one will probably be able to really truly describe what infinity is. It's the same thing. Oneness is something that none of us in our lifetime will ever see or achieve. We may achieve oneness within ourselves, but oneness of the universe, that is something that existed before time, and it will exist just after time. And at this point you say you have a kind of stop in all the cycles. Fate has kind of stopped because it's so vastly dispersed. Time, as a result, is no longer driven forward, so it will stop. And of course life, and that is creation and destruction. At this point it will be all destruction. Maybe a tiny amount. No, I have no creation, because if there was any creation whatsoever, there would be essentially some driving force. Okay, fate would be able to act through that creation and be able to cause some movement. So at this point then you have maximum destruction. Now how do we have this maximum destruction? Because this is essentially what Ragnarok is at this point. This is when Ragnarok will occur. Whether you believe it will occur with Jormungand coming out of the seas and poisoning the skies, with Thor slaying him, and Heimdall and Loki fighting one another within Asgard, and that, whether you believe that or just take it metaphorically speaking, it doesn't matter. You know, I mean, the stories are there for a good reason, and I, for one, actually believe in it. But you know, you don't have to, and I wouldn't actually think any more negative of you as a pagan if you just saw them as metaphorical stories. There are some of the stories that I read that I just kind of take as, yeah, a metaphorical sort of representation, or our best way of representing what actually happened or will happen in the limitations of our own language. Sometimes language is limited. It cannot describe what is happening in a realm, a spiritual realm, that we are not fully connected to. We're partially connected to it, as I say, for our higher learning centers, but how can we describe what is happening in the spiritual realm when there may not be words within our language to be able to describe it? It's like, you know, you look at society today, the word email, computer, hard drive, processor, all the computer stuff, the atom, things like this, all the science that we've learned. If you were to take those words and then take them back 3,000 years ago, and you were to speak them to someone who is English speaking, because English kind of existed back then, but not quite. It was an older form of the language. In fact, actually, may not have even existed. Let's go back 1,000 years when English definitely existed. Okay, but even if you went back 1,000 years, English as a language existed to some degree. It hadn't fully evolved at that point. Let's go back 500 years, because English did exist 1,000 years ago, but it wasn't quite to the level it is now. 500 years ago, you would be able to communicate with someone. You would struggle, because it would be like reading a Shakespearean play, right? But you could understand them, and they might understand you. But if you start using words like email, processor, computer, hard drive, all these kind of shit, right? They ain't going to understand you, because they haven't got words for it at that point. Because their point of where they are within time has not grown enough to encompass these words. There'll be words that they have that we don't understand either. You know, farming implements that are just no longer used anymore may have been not forgotten because they're recorded somewhere, but the common man like you and I, no, we will not understand it, you know. And so they may use words like flagon. I don't know exactly what a flagon is. I know it's a measurement of beer or whatever, of alcohol, but I don't know exactly how much it is, like compared to a pint. I know exactly what a pint is, but flagon? No, I'm not yeah, I'm a little bit on that one. Okay, and so it's, you know, you can see how language, even within our own material realm, has its limitations over time, if you were to try and integrate at different times. And so integrating it between different realms, there's going to be even more limitation. And so, as I say, understanding the other realms, that is really difficult. And so understanding their contribution to oneness and everything, even harder. But as I say, as we reach our endpoint, I've gone off a little bit there, but let's start focusing again. As we reach our endpoint, as I say, you have nothing essentially by the end. The cycles have stopped, or are really grinding to a stop, and this oneness, as I say, which I can't quite describe unless you've felt it, seen it, kind of meditated upon it, focused upon it using the runes or whatever. That's what I was trying to get into. I can't describe it to you. You have to experience it for yourself, and I implore you, please go out and experience through trance what oneness is. Try to achieve just a tiny little experience of it, which is what I've had, a tiny experience. But it allows you to then at least comprehend it enough to then start doing videos like I'm doing here, where you're describing things and understanding the progression of the universe and the end of the universe and then the rebirth. Why this happened. I'm not just taking this as given. I'm not letting paganism preach to me. I'm learning from paganism. It's talking to me. It's teaching me. And I'm assimilating the information into the point now where I understand it. That's why paganism doesn't preach. It teaches you, and you just have to take it in your own time. Some of us may be slower learners than others, but it doesn't matter. You will still learn as much as you can learn within your lifetime, and that's what it's all about, achieving the maximum amount of learning. But as I say, we have this oneness, and constantly for the universe this oneness is being built up as all the probabilities and possibilities that fate can achieve in the time period that it has achieves. And as it achieves them, this oneness grows, and as we reach the end of time, the end of creation, and the maximum amount of destruction, we have all this oneness. And this oneness, as I say, is potential. It's like potential energy. It's like holding up something very heavy on a shelf, for example. But if you remove the screws out of that shelf, then the whole thing will come crashing down. And that's essentially where you are at this point. You've got a shelf holding back all this potential energy. But then there is a slip, and that is fate. Fate, as I say, is achieve the oneness that it was attempting to achieve, but the oneness is not fully complete because not every possibility and probability was achieved. It's a form of oneness, but it's not a complete oneness. And so, bang! It forces the oneness out again. It forces them out for a prism of separation, essentially, and the oneness becomes divided into an infinite number of probabilities and possibilities again, through this prism of separation, ultimately. And then fate causes time to start again so that these probabilities can be achieved, and this time different probabilities and possibilities will be achieved, or a different combination of at least anyway. And so in the next state of its reality, because this is now a new macro cycle, a new reality, new set of spirit realms, a new set of material, well, a new material realm and all the rest of it, and the oneness becomes that bit more complete by the time it hits the second cycle. Then the third cycle becomes a bit more complete, but it still needs an infinite number of cycles for it to achieve its infinite amount of oneness, which is essentially what it needs. If it's completing an infinite amount of probabilities and possibilities, its overall target is to achieve infinite oneness. And that's unachievable unless you have an infinite amount of attempts to do it. And that's where you go. And that's, as I say, fehu is this potential, this desire at this point. Fehu's this potential that has then been separated, and the desire just before these actions are achieved, the desire to achieve as much as possible. That's fehu. But as I say, this oneness, which just is prior to fehu, grows through every macro cycle, through every destiny that is completed, destiny of the entire universe. That is not destiny of you or destiny of whatever, but from cosmology to creation of the cosmos to Ragnarok, there is a learning, there is an increase in the oneness of the universe, and it's this continual process. This is why we know there'll be an infinite number of cycles. But this is why we also know, as I say, we will have Ragnarok again, and again, and again, and always will. Now, how do we get to Ragnarok? So I've explained why we will have an infinite number of Ragnaroks. Why do we get, as I say, within the material realm, we've seen like this dispersion of energy to the point where it reaches absolute zero, where nothing happens. We get the same with fate, when it becomes it's so spread out that it just can't achieve anything feasibly anymore. It's just too vastly dispersed for fate to be strong enough to achieve anything significant, at least anyway. But how do we get to that point? if there was still a reasonable amount of entities that could achieve, fate, I believe, would probably focus. But at the end, there is nothing. There is just dust. And try as you must, you can't do much with dust. Who knew I was a poet, eh? That's from an old drinking song. I adapted it, and I'm not going to tell you on here because it's very rude. But try as you must, you can't work with dust, let's say. And you know, fate can't do anything. But if you had something alive at this point, it might be able to work with it. But we know life can't exist without energy, so it's gone. So fate can no longer really do anything. It can't work within the material realms, at least, anyway, and I assume it's a similar process within the spiritual realms. I can't answer for that, but it's an assumption, because otherwise, why is Ragnarok predicted? There must be some kind of limitation within the spirit realms also. But ultimately, how do we get to the point where everything is just dust? Well, it's paradoxical. Fate pushes forward to cause the completion of actions. As I say, the completion of action, no matter whether it's on the atomic level, on our level, or on the celestial level, doesn't matter. Every time something is achieved, that is a form of creation, even if it's a form of static creation. Okay, and like the table that I described before, and creation is life. Okay, it's life energy just contained within a particular format. Okay, like the table is inanimate, but that's life energy contained within the shape of a table. Life is contained within me, within my consciousness, or my soul, if you wish to describe it as that, but my consciousness, my higher consciousness, and my subconsciousness. And of course, my subconsciousness also represents my body as well. Okay, so I'm here physically talking to you through myself, or through my soul, through my consciousness, but using my body to do so. And I've acquired this knowledge through my higher learning centers, which is my higher consciousness. And as I say, I'm just another life form, or another form of life. But every time something is created, or every time an action is fulfilled, that action, if it's just simply something that happens, bang, like something dropping, like I did before, the stone dropping, every time that ends, it stopped dropping. And so then there's a destructive energy, in the sense that, well, the potential energy that I had there has gone to kinetic energy, it's changed, and then when I've put it back down, all that energy is just sort of gone. It's no longer contained within me. It actually originally came from me, because I was the one fueling the process. I was giving energy to the stone, giving it potential energy, letting it convert the potential energy into kinetic energy. It's still got potential energy, but a much lower potential energy than it did up here. But we haven't lost energy, because remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. But we have converted energy, and it's sort of dispersed. And this is what happens every time you do anything that is created, and ourselves included. When we are created, when we are born, eventually we will die. And so what I'm saying is, anything that is created eventually comes to an end. It could be as abrupt as dropping a stone. So that potential energy that I put into it, which came from me, has gone. So I've lost some of my energy by doing that. Every time I've done it, I've lost some of my energy, and that energy has been dispersed throughout the universe. And it's been dispersed chaotically as what we would describe within science, entropy. And you can describe it as entropy within paganism also, the same term is used. Okay, and so there is an entropy, there is a decay of matter, at least, and a decay of energy into ultimately just until the point when it's just energy, but energy doing nothing. Ultimately, energy is there, but it's just so vastly dispersed. It's just the most minor amount of thermal energy you can imagine. That's how the world will end, as just thermal energy. But so vastly spread out that it might as well not be there. But if you were to clump it all together, you've got the universe. Okay? So if you can get your head around that concept, what I'm trying to say is that every time you create something, bear in mind the universe is creating a hell of a lot as we're talking. Stars are being born, planets are being born, but stars are also dying, planets are also dying, so on and so forth. On Earth, there are people being born, God knows how many hundreds of thousands at any given point, and people are dying. And so there's creation and destruction. And so what I'm trying to say is every time something is created, ultimately you lead to that thing being created to ultimately being destroyed. And so if that thing is maintained, like for example, if you feed yourself, look after yourself, keep warm in the winters, so on and so forth, you'll live for about 80 years if you're lucky, maybe 100 if you're really, really lucky. Okay, and let's say for 100 years, the energy within you, although may partially disperse to some degree as you get older, that ultimately that energy of at least your spirit, whatever, and the energy that forms your body and all the rest of it is contained. But there is still that potential for entropy, and as soon as you die, all that entropy begins to be released. It's not an instant process, obviously. Rotting, things like this, or if you're burnt, then it's a lot quicker, obviously, then the energy is all released. But even the dying process, the soul or the spirit or the consciousness leaving the body, takes a period of time. It takes at least a few hours, if not a few days, for it to go to, say, the afterlife you're destined to go into. And so there's this dispersion of energy, and of course the spirit, your spirit, is then preserved within the spiritual realms until Ragnarok comes and everything is destroyed, both in the spirit realms and the material realms, apart from the very few. A couple of Force sons, Freya, a couple of humans, but other than that, pretty much everything else is destroyed. Even Earth itself or Midgard, the realm of Midgard itself is destroyed. So how those humans exist, it's a bit of a brain racker there, and something that maybe I'll have to focus on in the future. But what I'm trying to say is every time you create something, you're creating potential energy, or potential entropy energy, essentially, potential entropy, which doesn't really exist. Entropy is entropy, but what I'm trying to say is an action that is over abruptly, bang, entropy is created instantly. Entropy is created instantly in that sense. I think I've got a ghost behind me. The door's open here randomly, sorry, I'll just ignore it. I paused the video and called out hello, and there's no one there, so God knows what it is. But you get used to it after a while. If you like ghosts, by the way, watch Big Al's Haunted. It's a series that I have on here that I haven't really added to recently, but I've got a lot of footage where shit like this happens. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is whether it's over abruptly or over in 100 years, it's still on the large scale of things, on a universe life scale, like, it's less than a blink. Okay, and so the energy contained with us is converted into entropy. Anything that's created is converted into entropy sooner or later. Even the stars, which live for billions of years, eventually die, and their energy is given into entropy. Okay, and so eventually, at the beginning, obviously, when you've got mass creation, yes, you have a little bit of destruction, but destruction's tiny. But creation at this point is massive. Okay, and the reason destruction's minimal is because there's minimal amount of things that's been created, but the potential for creation is still there, and so creation gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger at a very exponential rate. Creation leads to creation. For example, if you create a life form like myself, and I go have children, let's say I have 3 children, I'm actually creating more energy. I'm turning myself of 1 person into 3 people, with my partner obviously 2 people into 3 people, but there's still an increase in the overall creative energy. And that's why creation leads to more creation, leads to more creation, to more creation, and creation as a whole will outnumber or outmatch the destruction that exists. But the potential for destruction is massive. It's all of that creation plus whatever destruction is going on at that particular point in time. Destruction is always equal to destruction plus creation. Destruction is actually stronger than creation, and that's why it always wins. That is why you have Ragnarok. Destruction will always, because destruction is fed by creation. If there was no creation, destruction wouldn't exist. But without creation, you wouldn't have life, and as a result, no destruction. Without creation, you wouldn't have destruction, but you would also have no life. You'd have fate pushing time going forwards, but there would be no actuation of possibilities. Fate would just creating time for no reason whatsoever, and it would then just occur for infinity. But there'd be no driving force. So actually, fate would not drive anything. Why would it move the universe forwards? Why would it create time if there's no fights to achieve? And this is then the answer as to why we get a separation of oneness. Before, I had not a great understanding of why we had a separation from oneness, but just through talking through this video with yourselves, thank you. You've allowed me to learn. I teach you, but you teach me. Even though there's no dialogue, it's a monologue. I'm talking to myself ultimately, but you are listening, I hope, eventually on YouTube. We've just worked it out. Oneness. Why does it fragment? We've just answered it. Because fate, unless it's got possibilities to fulfill, will not create time, will not then create life, i.e. the creation destruction cycle. It needs to fulfill possibilities and probabilities, and so fate must have possibilities and probabilities to fulfill, and those probabilities are combined when you have a state of oneness all together in just this one sort of big blob of oneness. That oneness is just possibilities, but contained probabilities and possibilities, unachievable at this point. Possibilities and probabilities, they're not out there to be achieved. But fate will cause this fragmentation, this dispersion of oneness across the universe, to create an infinite number of probabilities and possibilities which it will then try to achieve. And the reason it creates an infinite of possibilities and probabilities is because with the cycling of fate, there is an infinite amount of fate, and so it will create an infinite number of probabilities. But in hindsight, that's what allows it to continue forever and ever and ever through macrocycle after macrocycle after macrocycle. But it's still, why did you do it? You have a finite amount of fate. If you weren't for the recycling element, you should have just created a set number of possibilities, and bang, you'd have one reality. You'd achieve your oneness again. But it will never do it. But by doing so, perhaps this is the reason why, maybe fate has a kind of intelligence to it to some degree. I'm not saying that it's divine. I'm not saying that it's controlled in any way, although the Norns do obviously weave fate, but I think they work with it. They don't necessarily create it, they just work and weave it and so on and so forth. So there's no control of fate as such, but fate is like any living organism, and fate is part of, life. Ultimately, we've got creation, destruction, but when we tap into magic, into life, or the very weird, we can interact with fate. You can interact with Seda, for example. We can actually tangibly interact with fate. We can see the strands of fate, for example, and interact with them. We can possibly, and if you're particularly adept at Seda magic, in theory, you can change fate. You can play with the strands, a bit like the Norns do. Okay, now you can't change destiny, so you can never stop Ragnarok, but you can influence the fates within your life, or at least see the paths that are ahead of you and choose. That's what you do. You see the paths that are ahead of you, and you pick the path that you want to lead. And that's no different. It's not magic as such. We call it magic within paganism, but for those of you who think that, you know, magic is a bit wacko, no, it's not. Because all you're doing is actually just doing the same thing as any other person, trying to think ahead. You're looking at your future. You're looking at things and you're going, I want to achieve this in 10 years. I want to be married. I want to have kids. I want to have this job. And this is how I'm going to do it. You know, I'm going to study so I can get the right job. Once I've got the right job, then I'll start dating. When I have the woman, you know, then I'll try and have kids if we're able to have kids, so on and so forth. And that's how you achieve your plan. Well, you are purposely at that point deciding what your fate is. You are studying, you're going down a certain path that will lead you to a certain fate. And if you don't have a destiny, then you are a master of your own fate. But there are maybe certain points in your life that are destinies, and regardless of how much you try, you will be dragged along to there. But ultimately, for the mass majority of the time, there's a saying within Nordic paganism, at least anyway, and it was very popular amongst Vikings. You're born and you die, but you get to choose what to do with your life in between those 2 points. I haven't said it word for word exactly, but essentially, you're born, there's only 2 things that are set: your birth and your death. What you do with it, your life in between those 2 points, that's down to you. Essentially, that's how it's said. Okay, and that's what they mean, is essentially, yes, fate is fate, but unless you have a destiny, you are a master of your own fate to some degree. Yes, and yes, you are limited in the possibilities and probabilities that are presented to you, so you do have a sort of scuppered, sort of linear fate track that you can go along. You can't just say, well, I want to live on Pluto. Well, no, you can't go live on that planet because it's impossible, right? So the fate that could lead you to living on Pluto, that doesn't connect with you in any way whatsoever, so it becomes an impossibility. But anything that's possible for you, they are all there within your strands of fate at any point in time, but you choose which path to go down when you live in that fate out. So we've talked a little bit about why Ragnarok will always occur, because of the dispersion of fate over a massive amount of space, and to the point where it can no longer achieve. But at that point, it would have achieved the maximum potential possibilities and probabilities that it could have achieved, and so it has achieved oneness, and that oneness will be a greater level because it will be the probabilities and possibilities that is achieved in previous realities plus all the probabilities and possibilities that's achieved in this reality combined. And so the oneness that it has or has achieved grows and grows and grows every time there's a new reality, a new life cycle. And when you reach this point when there is a stasis, the Isa moment, as I say, within the runes, it's only because oneness is there, but fate is constantly pushing that oneness apart and fragmenting it, because it must have possibilities to achieve, because if it hasn't got possibilities to achieve, fate can't do anything. Fate is simply a driving force that causes potentials or potentialities or probabilities to become actualities, to become actions, to become events, to become reality. And in doing so, it creates time as a byproduct. Okay? Because for things to be achieved, you must require time. So we've answered why we have Ragnarok, but we've also answered why we get oneness, which I understood anyway. I wanted to talk about that because obviously the feedback of all this self and other combined, you know, all these achieved probabilities leading to an increased state of oneness over time. So oneness grows as the universe progresses, but the amount of the rate at which it grows slows down over time. But once that oneness has been achieved, that is greater than any previous oneness that has ever existed, is achieved, you then get fate fragmenting it again, leading to the birth or the rebirth of reality. So we know why there's the rebirth, but we also know why there's an end. I mean, we also know that there's also going to be an infinite amount of realities, because there's an infinite amount of possibilities, and you need an infinite amount of cycles to achieve an infinite amount of probabilities. We've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. I've gone way in more depth than what I have done before, so thank you guys for listening, or at least giving me the incentive to film this, because without talking for an hour to myself or to you, I would not have achieved this conclusion. I feel my knowledge is developed, and I hope I can concrete it and maintain it within my mind, within my soul, my spirit, my consciousness, and I hope you do too. Now, with that, we have a super strong foundation of knowledge on the framework of the universe, on time, on life, creation, destruction, and the whole recycling of everything back into a new creation. So we understand the framework of the universe now, and so with that we can talk about the runes on a cosmological scale, because this is what ultimately led me to attaining this information that I've just talked about in this video and in previous videos. It's the focusing on the runes and thinking of them not just on an individual level, because that's how often they're mostly used for like divination, for stuff like that, or focusing on your inner self. There's nothing wrong with that, because you must develop self, but if you're thinking of them on a cosmological scale, you see the bigger picture. And what I'm going to do is to have a proper discussion on the runes, to talk about them to the fullest of depths, like we've done with this video. I'm going to separate them into their 3 ayats. Ayat is a modern term, idea. It's not something the Vikings, for example, would have done, or the ancient Celts, the ancient Britons would have done. They would have never separated the fehu alphabet into 3 ayats, but it's almost like having a periodic table. It splits the runes conveniently into 3 distinct stages and allows you this to sort of take bite-sized chunks out of that and understand it better, and then when you put it together you still get the whole picture. And so that's why I use the ayats. I don't normally use modern interpretations of our ancient teachings, but this is why I do it, because sometimes improvements are made. Paganism, as I say, is an organic process. We have knowledge now that people wouldn't have had 1,000 years ago, because pagans have taught one another. We've also lost a lot of knowledge, which is a shame, because, you know, of the killing of the druids and all that, but you know, in the Isle of Man and stuff. So we've lost a lot of knowledge through persecution over the thousands of years that we've been persecuted, but we've also gained knowledge, or we're regaining knowledge that we used to have, and as I say, setting that as a foundation for future generations, because I don't think paganism is at its end. In fact, I think paganism is moving very quickly towards its next golden age. Maybe in my lifetime, maybe not, maybe in 500 years. I don't know how long it will take to get there, but we are moving towards a new golden age, and I want to be there, either at the beginning or whatever stage I am at now, helping give a bump up, so to speak, to paganism, to get into that point. And I believe any hammer of the gods, Celtic god myself, and I believe there's one other hammer of the gods that we know of, isn't there, Celtic god? I forget his name now, you have to remind me. But we had a talk, I think, with him. I don't know if he's a hammer of the gods or not, but anyway, regardless, even himself, all pagans as a whole, but certainly the hammer of the gods, we have that responsibility built into us. It's why one of the reasons why we come back. But all pagans as a whole have this responsibility to further progress ourselves and our people, our belief and our faith. So thanks for listening, guys. I hope it made sense. I haven't bored you, and I hope what I said is right. Obviously my knowledge is consistently progressing, and the bits of my knowledge that are wrong are constantly regressing. I have a mentor who helps, Celtic God, who guides me in his opinion, and greater knowledge. He has much greater knowledge than I have, and so he guides me. And sometimes it's quite funny because we see things, and I'm at an earlier stage of understanding than him. His higher centers are far beyond mine, but I can't fully always understand his higher centers because I'm not there yet. I'm not ready. But he's gently helping me up. Maybe one day we'll be equals. I very much doubt it, but that's what we're doing. He's helping me up, and I want to help you up along with myself, so we all progress together. Thank you very much, guys. Bye bye.